some point it would get caught, and it would most usually do that. But if you really had a concerted effort to mask something, it's possible to do it. Whereas if you had third-party testing, you wouldn't have that problem either. Any other questions? Okay, yes, I think you had your hand up first.
What was the time delay between the first market and the second market before the patents?
Well, that depended. Usually, there'd be 2 or 3 companies working on the same type of drug at the same time. And when one turned out to be, you know, you kind of knew your competitor was ahead of you to some extent. And so when that happens, you might reposition your drug if you're going to be second to market, by which I mean if the other company was putting out a certain dose or a certain method of delivery, you know, like oral versus nasal or something, you might change that in the process. And sometimes there would be a matter of months in between the two, and sometimes there would be many months. It just depended on how far the program was along. Now, the FDA, of course, can manipulate this. How do they do this? Well, if they know, of course, every drug company that's doing anything, because you have to let them know, otherwise you can't do the human studies. So some of the FDA examiners were taken to task because they played the game of keeping one drug company from getting to the market before the other one by simply demanding more studies. You see, when you submit stuff to the FDA, at any point in time they can say, you know, I think you need more studies of this, this, and this, and this. And you don't dare object because you have, you know, 10, 15 drugs in the pipeline, and if you get them upset about one drug, you're kind of nervous that maybe, you know, they'll punish you by delaying your other ones. So now the FDA can actually manipulate who gets first to market. Yeah, so it's a whole other factor. Yes, in the back.
I hear stories of my predecessor, Mark Fritz, who used to have a routine of doing a speech. He would grab an electric cord and go like this. And his point was, why do I think that's safe? And the point he was making was that this is tested by a private firm called Underwriters Laboratory. Is there or was there an institution like that in the drug industry that assured people without government intervention of the safety of their drugs?
The question was, is there something like Underwriters, or was there something like Underwriters Laboratory before the FDA came along to ensure that there was third-party testing and some types of safety testing? And the answer is yes. Even though the drug industry was pretty young, the AMA actually did tests and reported on them in their journal. Also, Consumers Research did so. There was something called Pharmaceutical Letters, which is still around today, which talked about the different drugs and their impact on patients. So there were a lot of different ways in which people knew about safety effects of drugs. And very interestingly enough, usually the increase in regulation followed some type of drug disaster. And the one that really began the safety testing at the FDA was an instance where an antibiotic was dissolved in an unsafe liquid. And that was because prior to that time, you know, you didn't have a solution. It wasn't well absorbed. And they were trying to get something that was well absorbed, but they didn't do any testing, and it turned out not to be safe for children. And I bring this to your attention because the physicians who were paying attention to the AMA evaluation weren't using it because it had not been evaluated by them yet. So the market was protecting the physicians who paid attention to the testing that their own society did. And incidentally, even though that looks like it was negligence on the part of the drug manufacturer, the chemist who put that together killed himself over that incident because he was so distressed by it. So clearly it was a mistake, not some type of nefarious profit-making motive, because there really is no profit in killing your customer. In fact, it's very detrimental to the health of the company.
My recollection was the thalidomide company pulled the product as soon as they heard the first reports before there was any official confirmation.
Thalidomide, this wasn't thalidomide, this was sulfonamide.
No, I'm saying my recollection from the stuff I've read on thalidomide was the company was the one that pulled the drug off the market, not the government regulators.
Well, in the case of thalidomide, of course, it came out in Europe. It hadn't been approved in the U.S. And what happened with thalidomide, just for those who don't know the history, it was actually a drug that was saving lives. The reason being, it was a very safe sleeping drug, and a lot of people were dying from barbiturate overdose. You know, you've heard the stories of Marilyn Monroe and other famous people who've died. Well, that's what was happening. People were taking overdoses. Not on purpose, but just because it was so easy to overdose. Well, thalidomide didn't have that problem. It was great. You could take a lot of it. But what happened was, pregnant women started taking it because they started realizing that it helped their morning sickness. And it did. But the problem is that they took it in a 4-week period during their pregnancy, and it had to be that 4-week period. They had children that were born either without limbs or with shrunken limbs. And at first the company, I think, kind of backpedaled on it. They could hardly believe it. And this is a natural tendency. You know, you want your drug out there. It's been good, so good, you know, you can't believe it's got something like this wrong. But this is why, it's what I was saying earlier. At the time, we didn't appreciate how sensitive the fetus was compared to the mother. We just didn't have that knowledge. At least most people didn't. It was out there, but it wasn't well known. So at first they didn't think it was really happening, and then they finally withdrew it, of course. And the company went bankrupt, if I recall. Now what was interesting is that the FDA banned this drug. It didn't say, well, men can take it. It just banned it, okay? It never approved it, and it wasn't going to consider it. Well, what's interesting is this drug happens to work against a disease that has a long history, a very long history of making people miserable. It works against leprosy. And it's now finally, after much trauma on the part of the people who are trying to help people with leprosy, is being tested. So, you know, no drug is perfectly safe. No drug is always effective. It depends on the individual and what you're using it for. And that's why it's so important to be careful on this. Now, let's see, I wanted to see if anybody else who hasn't spoken, you didn't have a chance yet.
I was wondering if any of the drugs that were on the market prior to the regulations are in peril.
Yes, the question was, are any of the drugs on the market before the regulations in peril? The answer is yes. What the FDA did is they said, okay, if you're on the market already, you have to bring us proof that your drug works, and if you don't, then you can't market it anymore. Now, of course, there were so many drugs on the market at that point, they really, and this was kind of before they had defined everything well, so what they did is they asked a panel of physicians to rule on whether they were effective. Now, let's get this straight. The new drugs had to jump through all these hoops and get 2 U.S. studies that showed certain statistical significance, but the old drugs got to have a panel of physicians, which is what the old system was about. Very strange. Anyhow, so this panel of physicians ruled that only about 10% of the drugs were worthless, and even that was questionable because some of the manufacturers said, hey, you know, our drug has been supplanted by new drugs now. It's, you know, not as good as the newer drugs on the market. We're not going to spend all our money bringing you evidence of efficacy. We're just going to take it off the market. It's just not worth fighting for. So that 10% is high. But what the FDA did then, as years went by, is it started saying, well, you know, these drugs that are still on the market from before '62, we need a little more evidence. And they started requiring more and more. So some of these drugs are, even now, being taken off the market. Sometimes because the manufacturer simply doesn't want to go through all the hassle of taking what's now a generic drug and bringing it through in a way that would satisfy the FDA. Way in the back.